For 13 years, he'd been the backbone of the overnight freight operation, moving cargo, organizing shipments, making sure deliveries reached their destinations on schedule. Eddie seemed like every other aging warehouse employee working to make ends meet, until catastrophic infrastructure failure left entire regions without food and medicine, and everyone discovered that the worker they'd overlooked had designed the emergency protocols they desperately needed. Edwin Charles Rodriguez was 74 years old, with graying black hair that showed traces of his Puerto Rican heritage and dark brown eyes that tracked inventory movements with the systematic attention of someone who understood that logistics was the invisible foundation keeping modern civilization functioning. His weathered hands bore the calluses of physical labor, but they moved with the precision of someone who had spent decades coordinating complex operations where timing meant the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we continue this incredible tale of hidden expertise and supply chain salvation, tell me in the comments what city you're watching from today. And if you believe stories about quiet masters deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. Southwest Regional Distribution Center occupied a sprawling complex outside Phoenix, Arizona, where 46 loading docks processed freight that supplied retail stores, medical facilities, and emergency services across Nevada, Utah, Colorado, and New Mexico. The facility operated around the clock, with day shifts handling routine deliveries and night crews managing time-sensitive shipments that needed to reach their destinations before business hours. Eddie worked the midnight shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., coordinating freight movements that most people never thought about but depended on completely. Medical supplies that kept rural hospitals functioning, food deliveries that stocked grocery stores in isolated communities, and emergency equipment that allowed first responders to save lives in regions where the nearest major city was hundreds of miles away. His job title was warehouse associate, but Eddie's actual responsibilities far exceeded basic freight handling. He coordinated complex shipping arrangements, resolved routing problems that could delay critical deliveries, and maintained the systematic organization that allowed a 40-person night crew to process thousands of shipments without losing track of anything important. Eddie, we've got a problem with the medical shipment to Flagstaff. The primary route is closed due to construction and the driver doesn't know the alternate routing. Send him through Sedona and up 89A. It's 20 minutes longer, but the road conditions are better for refrigerated transport. Make sure he knows to check the temperature controls at the halfway point. These quick problem-solving conversations happened dozens of times each shift. Eddie had developed an encyclopedic knowledge of transportation networks, delivery schedules, and logistics requirements that made him invaluable to operations that couldn't afford delays or mistakes. The warehouse management appreciated Eddie's reliability and expertise, though they didn't fully understand the depth of knowledge he brought to routine freight operations. His perfect attendance, systematic approach to complex shipping arrangements, and ability to solve problems that stumped younger workers made him an essential part of night shift operations. What none of them realized was that Colonel Edwin Rodriguez had spent 38 years mastering logistics operations on a scale that made regional freight distribution look simple by comparison. Eddie lived alone in a modest apartment 15 minutes from the distribution center, a practical two-bedroom unit that reflected the organized mindset of someone who understood that efficiency and personal life supported effectiveness and professional responsibilities. The furnishings were comfortable but unremarkable, chosen for function rather than style. But the second bedroom revealed capabilities that exceeded warehouse worker requirements. The walls displayed maps marked with transportation networks spanning multiple continents, supply routes that had supported military operations in environments where failure meant soldiers didn't receive ammunition, medical supplies, or basic necessities needed to complete their missions. Charts showing logistics coordination that had moved equipment and personnel across distances that civilian transportation companies would consider impossible. Bookshelves held technical references that most logistics professionals had never seen, military manuals for establishing supply lines in hostile territory, academic texts on operations research and systems optimization, and planning documents for humanitarian relief operations that had delivered aid to disaster-affected populations under conditions that would have defeated commercial distribution networks. And in a secured file cabinet were credentials that would have transformed how Phoenix's logistics community viewed their night shift warehouse worker. A master's degree in operations research from the Army War College, senior officer certifications for managing multi-theater logistics operations, and consulting agreements with federal agencies that coordinated disaster relief when civilian supply chains failed. Colonel Edwin Charles Rodriguez, United States Army Logistics Corps. 38 years planning and executing supply operations that kept American military forces functioning in every major conflict from the 1980s through the 2010s. His specialty had been complex logistics coordination under adverse conditions, moving supplies through hostile territory, establishing distribution networks in regions without existing infrastructure, and maintaining supply chain continuity when conventional transportation systems were compromised by combat, natural disasters, or infrastructure attacks. The career had taken Eddie from logistics planning that supported operations in Central America during the 1980s, to supply coordination during Gulf War deployments, to humanitarian relief missions where military logistics capabilities provided aid to civilian populations affected by disasters that exceeded local response capabilities. His expertise had been crucial in developing military logistics doctrine that influenced how the U.S. military approached supply chain management in the modern era. Eddie's planning had ensured that American forces received everything they needed to complete their missions while maintaining the efficiency that made large-scale military operations financially sustainable. Retirement in 2011 had been voluntary rather than mandatory. Eddie had accumulated enough military service to retire with full pension while still young enough to pursue civilian work that didn't involve the high-stress environment and constant deployment schedules that had characterized his military career. The warehouse job wasn't about financial necessity. His military pension provided adequate retirement income. It was about staying connected to logistics operations that served communities rather than military objectives, applying organizational skills to civilian supply chains that kept people's daily lives functioning smoothly, and using analytical capabilities for commercial distribution that supported economic rather than military security. But 38 years of military logistics expertise doesn't disappear because someone changes from military to civilian employment, and Eddie's trained eye continued monitoring supply chain vulnerabilities that could affect the communities he served through routine freight operations. Friday, March 15th started like every other night shift. Eddie arrived at the distribution center at 10:45 p.m., reviewed the evening's shipping schedules, and prepared for another night of coordinating freight movements that would supply retail stores, medical facilities, and emergency services across the Southwest region. The workload was heavier than usual due to seasonal demand increases and weather-related delays that had created backlog in delivery schedules. Medical supplies needed to reach rural hospitals before morning shift changes, emergency equipment required delivery to fire departments that were preparing for spring wildfire season, and food shipments had to arrive at grocery stores before weekend shopping periods. At 1:30 a.m., everything changed. A 7.2 magnitude earthquake struck along the San Andreas Fault System, centered near the California-Arizona border, with enough force to sever interstate highways, collapse bridge structures, and disable the transportation networks that connected Southwest communities to supply sources in California and major distribution hubs throughout the region. Eddie felt the ground movement in the warehouse, watched loading dock equipment shift and settle, and immediately understood that this seismic event had compromised transportation infrastructure across multiple states in ways that would affect millions of people within hours. But his trained mind also recognized something that civilian emergency management wouldn't identify for days. The earthquake had created logistics challenges that exceeded anything civilian supply chains were designed to handle. Military-style coordination would be required to prevent humanitarian crisis in communities that suddenly found themselves isolated from food, medical supplies, and emergency equipment they needed to survive. Eddie looked around the warehouse, where 46 loading docks connected Southwest communities to supply networks that had just been severed by natural disaster. As reports came in from drivers who were finding highways impassable and bridges collapsed, he realized that conventional logistics approaches wouldn't be sufficient to restore supply chain functionality before communities ran out of essential supplies.
Colonel Rodriguez faced a choice that would define how effectively the Southwest region responded to the worst natural disaster in its modern history. He could work within his warehouse associate position, following civilian emergency protocols, while hoping that federal disaster management would develop effective logistics coordination before communities experienced humanitarian emergencies. Or he could use 38 years of military logistics expertise to implement supply chain restoration that went far beyond civilian capabilities, drawing upon operational knowledge that could save lives if applied quickly enough. Eddie made his decision in approximately 15 seconds. Attention all warehouse personnel. This is Colonel Edwin Rodriguez, U.S. Army Logistics Corps, retired. We are implementing emergency logistics protocols to maintain supply line continuity to affected communities. The transformation was instantaneous. The night shift warehouse worker disappeared, replaced by a military logistics officer with nearly 40 decades of experience coordinating supply operations under impossible conditions. We're establishing emergency distribution networks using available transportation assets, alternate routing through secondary roads, and priority shipping for medical supplies and emergency equipment. All personnel will receive tactical assignments based on operational requirements. Over the next 16 hours, Eddie coordinated supply operations that restored connectivity between Southwest communities and the resources they needed to survive infrastructure failure. He established alternate transportation routes using secondary roads that could handle freight traffic, coordinated with military logistics units that could provide airlift capability for medical emergencies, and implemented rationing protocols that ensured critical supplies reached communities based on population density and medical requirements rather than commercial delivery schedules.
His warehouse facility became the nerve center for emergency logistics operations spanning 4 states, handling everything from coordinating medical supply airlifts to rural hospitals to establishing fuel delivery networks for emergency vehicles that were conducting search and rescue operations. Colonel Rodriguez, this is FEMA Region 9 requesting coordination for emergency supply delivery to isolated communities. FEMA, this is Rodriguez. I've established alternate supply routes using Forest Service roads and coordinated with National Guard aviation units for airlift to communities that are completely cut off. We're maintaining 72-hour supply buffers for critical medical supplies and have established fuel distribution points for emergency vehicles. By 3 p.m. the following day, Eddie had restored supply chain functionality for most essential services throughout the affected region. But the effort had revealed infrastructure vulnerabilities that exceeded what civilian logistics systems were designed to address without military coordination. Colonel Rodriguez, how did you coordinate such complex logistics operations from a commercial warehouse? Asked Federal Emergency Management Director Patricia Walsh during the emergency coordination meeting. Eddie looked around the FEMA command post that had been established in his distribution center, at the federal officials who had treated him as a peer rather than a warehouse employee. Director Walsh, military logistics training teaches you to maintain supply chain continuity regardless of infrastructure conditions. These communities needed the same kind of supply coordination that keeps military forces functioning in hostile territory. The story made logistics industry publications as an example of how experienced personnel could adapt civilian supply chains for disaster response. But most coverage focused on innovative techniques rather than the military expertise that had made such coordination possible. Eddie returned to his regular warehouse duties, coordinating freight with the same systematic attention that had characterized his pre-emergency work. But something had changed in how warehouse management and the broader logistics community viewed their night shift worker. Eddie was invited to consult on emergency preparedness planning, helped develop disaster response protocols that bridged military and civilian logistics capabilities, and trained emergency management personnel in supply chain coordination techniques that could function when conventional infrastructure failed. Eddie, how did you know how to coordinate such complex emergency logistics? Asked Miguel, a younger warehouse worker, during one of the training sessions Eddie had been asked to conduct. Eddie looked up from the routing charts he was explaining, his dark brown eyes holding the calm competence that never quite disappeared. Miguel, logistics is logistics, whether you're supplying military forces or civilian communities. The principles stay the same. Understand your requirements, identify your resources,
and coordinate transportation to get the right supplies to the right people at the right time. Colonel Rodriguez continued his warehouse work until he was 79, when age finally made the physical demands of freight handling impractical. He spent his final years training emergency logistics specialists in techniques that combined military supply chain expertise with civilian distribution capabilities. Because he learned that the most effective disaster response often required expertise that exceeded civilian training, coordination that continued regardless of job titles, and supply chain knowledge that served communities whether or not anyone realized the depth of experience behind routine warehouse operations.